Hey, my name is Nathaniel Fawson. I'm an archaeologist. I have been for over 10 years. And this channel is dedicated to the archaeology of North America prior to colonization by Europeans, in particular the region that we call the Eastern Woodlands. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. This first paper deals with two pretty iconic spearpoint types from the southeastern Early Archaic, particularly in the Carolina Piedmont. These are the Kirk and the Palmer. Both date to the Early Archaic, between about 10,800 and 10,000 years ago, and both are corner-notched. Back in the 60s, Joffre Coe described Palmer points as corner-notched with straight ground bases and serrated edges with very pronounced teeth. They're very similar to Kirk points, which do not feature ground bases, but also are not always, but frequently serrated with more moderately incised teeth. And the idea at the time was that the Palmer represented a transition from the Dalton horizon into the early archaic Kirk-notched points. Now, the question this paper is asking, is that at all correct? Are these actually two different point types at all? Now, typically, I'm going to try to avoid any graduate level theory issues, or at least save them for the end of the videos. But I really can't do that here because the question, what are types and are types real, is so fundamental to the goal of this paper that I have to address it up front. And this has been a big issue for archaeology since, I'd say, at least the 1950s. Are types inherently real, like point types, pottery types, things like that? Are these real things that exist, or are these just useful categories and concepts that archaeologists can use to do analysis? And is it always one, or is it always the other? It gets very, very messy. If we brought a person from 10,000 years ago into the present and showed them a bunch of Kirk and Palmer points, assuming that they could, also magically speak English or whatever, would this person look at that group of Kirk and Palmer points and sort them into two separate categories the same way that we would? And would they consider them different things? And then beyond that, does it actually matter if they perceive those artifacts as different categories? Might those categorizations be useful even if the people who used those points didn't see them as different? These are not easy questions, and the answers to them might be very different depending on the material you're working with and what your research question is. And we can see typologies in our own lives, of course. So like if you go into a kitchen, you're going to see a variety of cooking implements that you would naturally sort into pots and pans, for instance. These are types that we're very aware and conscious of, but that's not necessarily true for, all material culture across all time. Now, getting back to projectile points from 10,000 plus years ago, considering Kirk and Palmer to be discrete types implies, unless we explicitly state otherwise, that the people who made them were intentionally making them differently. Either you've got a generational gap where older people are making one thing and younger people are making another, or you have a cultural gap where some people contemporaries are making slightly different versions of the same thing, or it could be a functional distinction where one point type is being made for one function and the other point type is being made for another. But it could also very well be, and that's kind of what this paper is getting at, that the Palmer is just what happens when you take a Kirk and you refurbish it 2 or 3 times. So to address this question, the authors employed a collection called the Ashnach collection. It's 161 Palmer points and 128 Kirk points that were typed in lab based on the criteria set forward by Joffre Coe, who was involved in defining these 2 point types. This collection was collected by a pair of brothers named the Ashnach brothers, and these avocational collectors recovered archaeological materials from recently plowed fields like lots of people do today. What was different was they habitually recorded the same details about these surface finds that professional archaeologists would. Spatial coordinates, their distance to water, the kind of topography and elevation, and these other kinds of details that make their collection functionally equivalent to a collection put together, curated by professional archaeologists. So this is one of those things that we can actually use collector assemblages for. Now, the argument of the paper is that if Palmer points are in fact just worn down, refurbished Kirks, then the haft elements, those notches, or rather the stems produced by the notches, should be similar between Kirk and Palmer. And the blade thicknesses should also be reasonably similar. They should have strong overlap, but the blade length and width measurements should be different from each other. The Palmer should be smaller and the serrations should be deeper. So in this paper, they're calling the stem created by the corner notches the tang, which is unusual, but you know, we know what we're talking about. And they begin by comparing the length of that tang by its maximum width. And here you see the two types overlap with each other. They plotted the width of the tang base against the width of the neck, and these data points also completely overlap with each other rather than forming two discrete groupings. The same thing happens when you plot attributes like maximum length. When you separate them out by the assigned type, they form two different groups, but when you pool the groups together, they form a regular bell curve, which suggests that what's really happening is that the lab technicians are assigning big points to Kirk and small points to Palmer, rather than there being any real distinction between the two. This isn't true for the maximum width. Here you can see that the pooled data is starting to form two discrete groupings, which is to be expected when resharpening occurs. To quote the paper, when viewed as a single archaic corner-notched type, those points historically referred to as Palmer may have been so labeled precisely for their reduced length and greater thickness relative to width, but this itself may owe to resharpening of the blade element rather than to initial point design. When we look at the values for length divided by width and width divided by thickness, we find that Kirks are more broad-headed while Palmers are more stubby on average. This was an expected pattern if resharpening of Kirks was responsible for the Palmer type in the first place. At the end of the day, I find the argument fairly compelling. Basal wear can be the result of abrasion during the use life of the point. It doesn't have to be a deliberate attribute of the manufacturer of the point itself, which would explain why points designated as Palmer tend to have it and the ones designated Kirk tend not to. The Kirks are just from an earlier stage in the production and utilization cycle. So this is a good example of a kind of research that is feasible with surface collections put together by private avocational archaeologists. It's it's productive. It's useful. It helps us to get a clearer picture of some of the confusing attributes of what we've inherited in terms of our understanding of point typologies in the past. Is it the most groundbreaking or sexy archaeology you can do? No, of course not. It's these 2 point types are actually 1 point type. Cool. But it is something that is useful in the big picture. You get enough of these kinds of small scale research projects worked out, and they start to add up to clarifying a much bigger picture. So that's really all I've got to say for this first one back. I should have more coming out in the next couple of weeks. So if you have any questions, drop those in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching.